Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey peeps, welcome back. A few weeks ago, I had the honor of hosting friend and fellow podcaster Philip Shackelford to discuss his new book, Rise of the Mavericks. The book, which, if you're listening to this episode on release day, comes out today, tells the story of the early days of the U.S. Air Force Security Service and is a detailed look on the inner workings of government agencies. Philip is the library director at South Arkansas Community College in El Dorado, Arkansas. He holds both a master's degree in history and a master's degree in library and information science from Kent State University. His academic research focuses on the Cold War history of the U.S. Air Force and the Air Force Security Service. Lastly, Philip is also the creator, producer, and host of the weekly podcast show, The Modern Scholar Podcast, which features conversations with librarians, scholars, and community leaders who are performing cutting-edge work and share the same passion for educating, encouraging, and empowering those around them. We recorded our conversation on Zoom, so I'm inserting my standard audio quality warning here. I hope you all enjoy learning about Philip, his research, and the security service. Hello, everyone. With me today is fellow podcaster and author, Philip Shackelford. He is the host of one of my favorite podcasts, the Modern Scholar Podcast, and wrote the book Rise of the Mavericks, which comes out April 15th, or today, if you're listening to this on release day. The book will be the focus of our conversation today. But before we begin, welcome, Philip.
Well, thank you. And first of all, let me say thank you very much for having me on the show. I have been looking forward to this conversation very much, and I appreciate you having me on the show today. As you mentioned, my name is Philip Shackelford. A little bit about me. Perhaps most importantly, I am a dog dad to a 100-pound Great Pyrenees who's awesome. Sometimes you can catch a photo of him on Twitter. But yeah, I'm the library director at South Arkansas Community College, and I'm a military historian focusing on the U.S. Air Force, communications intelligence, and national security during the Cold War. I first became interested in kind of researching and writing about these topics during undergrad, but that interest was initially born of hearing my grandfather's stories growing up. My grandfather served in the Air Force during the early 1950s and was actually a member of the organization that I kind of began to research and to write about, and that's the U.S. Air Force Security Service.
That's awesome. Shifting to your book, Rise of the Mavericks takes readers on a journey through the establishment and early years of the Security Service. For those who may not know, what exactly was the Security Service?
Yeah. So just to give folks a broad overview, the U.S. Air Force Security Service was a communications intelligence and communications security agency created by the Air Force in 1948. Its mission was to gather communications intelligence that would provide, valuable information the Air Force needed to understand, to target, and prevail over opposing forces during the Cold War, as well as to protect the security of Air Force communications. That mission did fluctuate in the later years of the Cold War to include electronic warfare. The command was actually renamed the Electronic Security Command in 1979. This organization is not only fascinating, but it's also this incredible glimpse into the inner workings of American national security and intelligence gathering during the early Cold War. So, just to back up a little bit, the Air Force had been obliged to wait for a number of years as part of the U.S. Army before air leaders could really pursue service autonomy. And they knew that intelligence, especially in this new and uncertain environment of the Cold War, would be absolutely critical. These ideas were linked together. And there's this great quote from General George McDonald, who in 1947 becomes the first director of Air Force intelligence. But back in 1945, while the war is still going on, the Army Air Forces are still part of the U.S. Army. He writes this memo, and I'll read this quote, where he says, "It seems to me that when a service gives away dominion over its intelligence, it has in fact given up its independence. So these Air Force leaders knew what they're doing from the word go, and they immediately set about the task of establishing an effective communications intelligence organization that would provide the information they needed, and at the same time help the Air Force overcome its dependence on the Army. And one of the reasons we've hardly ever heard about this command is obviously many of the records related to the security service and its activities and its relationships with other government agencies remain classified, obviously. But another reason is that other intelligence agencies, such as the CIA, the National Security Agency, attract a lot more attention and are more explored in the literature. But the Security Service was important. It provides this useful lens to kind of look at the Air Force at large, and kind of examine some of these transformative developments that really characterized its transition from World War II into the Cold War.
And Rise of the Mavericks also includes stories about your grandfather's time in service. And, you'd mentioned kind of in your introduction that that's really kind of what got you interested in this topic. And so how did you differentiate the academic from the personal when trying to decide what to include?
Well, that's a great question. I think, especially considering the emphasis that is placed on objectivity in historical scholarship, and the warnings that we all receive to be careful with things like memoir and biography, and kind of the pitfalls that these formats can sometimes present. But for me, my grandfather's experience really represents an entry point, not only for me personally, as in terms of just recognizing and learning about this organization, that it even existed in the first place, but also as a way to personalize the narrative in the book a little bit. It's no secret that as humans, we tend to pay attention more and track information better when it's presented in the form of a story. And so by putting in a little bit of these personal elements, firsthand experience, a little bit of kind of day in the life perspective, that works wonders for the book. It kind of helps move the narrative along, keeps readers engaged. I mean, I think it also serves to break down this sort of bird's eye view perspective that I think often accompanies histories like this. We're reminded that these developments this history is moved along. It's experienced by real people. This is not just some sort of disembodied, impersonal thing that we get to read about all these years later. This was happened to and by real people. And I think by examining and putting those real life experiences in, it's anytime we have an opportunity to do that, it's a good thing.
Yeah, it was very apparent through reading the book that your grandfather was kind of almost like this emotional anchor, a through line character throughout the whole book to, like you said, drive the narrative. I was speaking with a professor a couple weeks ago, actually, about his book, and he did something very similar where he had a couple of characters just all through the book, and to kind of have that emotional grounding, and push that narrative forward. So it was. And he said it's very important. It really helps readers stay engaged. So it was great to see, after having that conversation, reading your book and following your grandfather's experiences.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This seems a lot like a labor of love. So how long have you been working on this project?
Well, thank you. I would say any kind of book is really qualifies as a labor of love. But yeah, in one form or another, I've been working on this topic for the better part of a decade. First in undergrad, then my master's thesis, various conference presentations, an article, and now the book.
Yeah. And you allude to it in your book, and you've also kind of touched on it in some of your responses already, but what was some of the most challenging aspects of putting this narrative together?
Yeah, sure. One of the most challenging aspects of this work, and really of anything that deals with national security and intelligence related topics, continues to be access to declassified source material. Much obviously still remains classified, and the documents that have been declassified tend to be scattered around the country in various different archives that are operated by various different organizations. So tracking all of that down and kind of patching together this tapestry of sources can be a challenge sometimes. But I will say, though, that the National Security Archive, which is headquartered at George Washington University there in DC, and the Digital National Security Archive database that they've put out with ProQuest, is a fantastic resource. I certainly would not have been able to do the research that I did without that database and the good people that brought it all together.
And your book is put together through, secondary research, archival research, and then some oral histories. And the names of several of the oral history participants were altered. So I'm curious, what motivated that decision?
Yeah, that was a choice that I provided to the former airmen that I interviewed. Many of them were wary, if not reluctant, to
Mm.
talk about their experiences and their time in the security service, and understandably so. I mean, they had been instructed at length not to say anything, not to talk about what they did. Many of them did not speak about it to their wives, to their families, and so to open up all of a sudden to a graduate student they've just met, and they're not sure exactly how their experience is going to be represented. You can see how that's kind of a hard thing to think about. So when I would set up an interview, I offered that as an option in the oral history permission form that I used,
Mhm.
giving them the opportunity to be identified or not. And yeah, in large part, I ended up obscuring most all of the names of the oral history participants. I think only in the case of my grandfather, obviously, and then if someone had produced something that I cited, such as a speech,
Right.
I would identify the specific person.
Awesome. And you discussed how World War II was a pivotal moment for intelligence. Can you expand on how and why?
Sure. World War II has been called a SIGINT war. SIGINT for signals intelligence, which is a term that was coined by, of course, the now famous cryptologist William Friedman. It's an apt description because when it came to signals intelligence, communications intelligence, the Allies really transformed the world of espionage and kind of laid the technological and the philosophical foundations for cryptologic work that really, in large part, remains in place to this day. Much of the Allied success in this area built on progress by British codebreakers who early in the war succeeded in cracking German Enigma traffic. That program and the information that it provided were known by the code name Ultra. And Ultra intelligence provided much needed insight for the Allies that, in situations that really helped achieve important victories. Where the United States in particular had some challenges was in the organization and the coordination of its intelligence agencies. Army and Navy intelligence units did not cooperate well with each other, and in fact, they behaved towards each other as rivals, which made for this problematic combination of overlap, duplication, squabbles over jurisdiction, and so forth. Following the war, following World War II, American military and government officials knew that this level of dysfunction could not be allowed to continue. And so they spent a lot of time after the war working and kind of arguing over how the United States intelligence apparatus would be and should be organized. And that included communications intelligence.
And a portion of the rise of the Mavericks kind of covers that evolution of military unification because as you just said, it was a little fragmented and they were competitive, and how that the different various military branches kind of unified under the aftermath of World War II. So, can you touch on this and kind of how it ties to the eventual establishment of the security service?
Yeah, absolutely. So military unification was a complex and contentious battle where many different parties, not just the U.S. military, had an interest in the outcome. World War II had placed the United States in this unprecedented situation. American soldiers, American industrial might had essentially become largely responsible for the preservation of Europe. And through the war and kind of the geopolitical associations, developments associated with it, the United States ultimately, becomes responsible for largely shaping the post-war world. But in order to successfully meet that task, updates and reforms were needed in the way that the U.S. defense establishment was organized. Both the Navy and the War Department had their own very specific ways of looking at the problem, and both services had their fair share of supporters and detractors in, the American Congress and in the public. A lot of the debate came down to the division of responsibility, how to eliminate duplication and maximize the potential that each service was able to bring to the table. And there were quite vocal perspectives that believed adding a third service, the Air Force, to the mix was unnecessary and would be a mistake. But for its part, the AAF, the Army Air Forces, had been working towards service independence for a long time. As supporters of the concept kind of pointed towards what was seen as, decisive success of strategic bombing during the war, the advent of nuclear weapons, the three-pronged joint operational concept in terms of land, sea, and air. All of these as examples of reasons why the Air Force was essential and warranted having its own independent service. Ultimately, of course, the Air Force was, in fact, established as an autonomous service with the National Security Act of 1947. And Air Force leaders and intelligence officers that kind of were working on this and starting to do some of the reorganization in the post-war years, they may not necessarily have seen themselves as disruptors, but they were very intent upon creating this communications intelligence capability that would provide for Air Force needs in a way that in this rapidly developing Cold War environment. And so just a little over a year later, after the National Security Act, the Security Service was established as well.
And throughout your book, you analyze the ongoing interagency battles. And so, how did this competition really influence the security service?
Well, so the acrimonious relationships that kind of characterize this dynamic between the services at large spilled over, obviously, into subordinate commands, and that included intelligence organizations. And that dynamic goes back a long time too, well into the war. Initially, the drive to overcome dependence on the Army for intelligence was a significant motivator for the security service. And the command took a variety of steps to get on its feet, insulate itself from outside control. But in practice, the tension that between the services and the intelligence organizations meant that competition and a disastrous lack of communication still persisted. And that became very clear during the early days of the Korean War. Army and Air Force elements that were attempting to establish a workable communications intelligence element operational on the ground struggled with each other for jurisdiction and responsibility. Communication back to military headquarters and national control offices was dysfunctional. And overall, it took a minute for things to get straightened out. Demonstrating yet again just how disastrous things could be when rivalry was allowed to take over.
Yeah. And as you're talking about the different developments of the security service, you assert that ground stations were foundational to the security service's international organizations or international operations, excuse me. So what were they and why did they prove so vital?
Great question. So the security service ground stations were essentially military installations or bases established in various locations around the world with antennas, receiving equipment designed to collect and intercept signals, decipher the messages that were being sent, and then ultimately send that intercepted information back to various headquarters where it could be analyzed and processed. Ground stations were essential to American intelligence efforts, especially early on in the Cold War, because various other methods for collecting signals intelligence were either in their infancy or hadn't yet come online, such as airborne collection platforms, photo reconnaissance, satellites, things like that. What made ground stations so important and really at times tricky is that they needed to be located in specific areas in order to best pick up the signals that were emanating from certain countries or certain regions. And so the U.S. government and the military often had to negotiate with a host country for basing rights, property to put one of these stations. But yeah, the number of ground stations that the security service operated expanded very quickly in the 1950s, and ultimately the command was responsible for collection sites located all around the world in at least 16 different countries.
Yeah, that part of the book was pretty fascinating to kind of really kind of ground how important and how influential all of that was. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that. And the 50s and 60s are described as important years for the security service. So what were some of the key developments that made this time so crucial?
Yeah, they were. And the way that I would describe them is that the 50s were a period of expansion, and the 60s were a period of maturation. for the security service. During the first few years of the 1950s, the security service recruited and trained thousands of airmen for specific communications intelligence assignments, developed dozens of overseas locations, new collection platforms, procedures, and strategies for responding to moments of crisis in such a way that reliable information would be provided to American military leaders and decision makers. The 1960s then brought the war in Vietnam. And the security service was involved from an early time, first through efforts to kind of locate and intercept military communications coming out of communist China. They established these listening posts in Vietnam and Thailand. And as the war really got underway, ultimately came to support American forces with information that helped fighter pilots, for example, become more successful. The 1960s also represented a kind of a passing of this old maverick attitude that seemed to characterize the early years of the security service. And we see the security service start to become more joint-minded, so to speak, more cooperative with its other service counterparts and national operational control as well.
And how does sharing this story contribute to our overall understanding of United States history and military history?
Yeah, so most of the literature focused on the history of American military cryptology specifically is incomplete. And what my book really tries to do is turn the attention to the security service, and by doing that, provide sort of a corrective nuance to the historiography that is disproportionately focused on the National Security Agency. And you can see why. It's this huge organization that carries a lot of bandwidth, especially in popular circles and kind of our modern day understanding of communications intelligence. But the security service provides this useful lens to really look at the Air Force at large, and again, kind of those transformative developments that characterize the transition from World War II into the Cold War, and really can be viewed as kind of a case study in military organizational culture, behavior, in regards to how the command originated and developed, but also then worked to develop autonomy and meet requirements of both service-oriented and national level missions. What we find is that the security service was a command that's largely missing from the pages of history, but was so closely entangled with these dramatic shifts and transformative developments that characterized the post-World War II period in the United States, that played an important role in kind of shaping the Air Force into a truly modern and capable strategic force. And that's a story that needed to be told.
And once people have devoured your book and they want to learn more about the security services or intelligence, where should they go?
Well, I would definitely appreciate anyone that would like to check out the book. Thank you for that. The book's available through the Naval Institute Press as well as Amazon and Barnes and Noble. So hopefully folks will be able to locate a copy one way or the other. Yeah, I also published an article in the U.S. Military History Review a few years ago, if folks want to check that out. And I'm working on a few additional articles that would explore different areas, different aspects of security service history. And occasionally write brief pieces for my website, which you can find at philipcshackelford.com. So folks can also get in touch with me there if they'd like to reach out.
Awesome. And is there anything we haven't talked about that you would like my audience to know?
Well, so I definitely hope your audience, finds the book fascinating, and I certainly hope everyone is able to pick up a copy if they'd like. But one thing I will say is that really this book is just scratching the surface. This is the first stab at a topic, at a story that is so overdue for research. As I mentioned, I hope to continue exploring this history and this topic in the years ahead. And as time progresses, more and more information will continue to be declassified, so that the security service the history of the story of the security service can be told in a more and more complete way.
Awesome. And as we begin to wrap up here, where can people go to learn more about you, your work, and of course, your book? You mentioned your website, so let's go ahead and plug that website again. But I know that you have Twitter, you're everywhere. So go ahead and tell everybody where to find you.
Sure thing. Yeah, thank you for that. I would encourage folks to start with the Naval Institute Press for the book. Whenever you can purchase books directly from the press, that's always a good thing. Their website is usni.org. And of course, there's my website again if anyone wants to learn more about me or check out some of the other things I'm working on these days. And again, that is philipcshackelford.com. One thing I'll add about my website, I have a speaking page on there. And if you are a teacher or an instructor, and I'd be happy to zoom into your class and talk about some of these things with your students. So just reach out through the form there, and we'll go from there. But yeah, I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention my show, the Modern Scholar Podcast, which you were kind enough to kind of shout out at the beginning, which you can find on major podcast platforms as well as online at modernscholarpodcast.com. We talk with scholars, librarians, community leaders, not only about the cutting edge work that they're doing, but also kind of trying to demystify various aspects of these professions for those that may not have had a glimpse behind the scenes. So feel free to check out some of those venues. And yeah, I appreciate it very much.
Yes, I have one of your episodes in the queue for today. It will be very stale by the time this episode goes live, but you talked to a couple of academic editors and publishers, so I'm very interested to hear kind of that behind the scenes. And since I have you, I'm going to ask you, what was your experience like with the academic publishing market?
It was fantastic. I really have to say, Naval Institute is really great to work with. And I initially made contact with the series editor for this series that my book is appearing as part of this series. PJ Springer, he's a professor at the Air War College down at Maxwell Air Force Base, and he's the series editor for the Transforming War series at Naval Institute. And he and I had kind of developed this relationship over several years. He was actually the commenter on the very first conference panel that I did several years ago, and so he was aware of kind of what I was doing and what I was researching, and we would have these conversations at every conference every year when we turned up. We would kind of meet and kind of talk about this stuff. And it was a few years ago, 2019, at the conference, the Society of Military History, that we were talking about it again. And he said, "Yeah, I'm interested. Let me get you my proposal guidelines and fill that out, and we'll go from there." So that was fall 19. I submitted the proposal, and then of course the next spring the pandemic hits. Right. So the pandemic really became my writing time in a lot of ways. The heaviest writing I think took place in 21. And then just working with PJ, working with the press could not have gone smoother. For anyone that is kind of navigating this for the first time, if that's something that you'd like to reach out and talk to me about, I'm happy to share more about that experience. But yeah, it could not have gone smoother. Very blessed, awesome. And very happy. Yeah.
I've heard wonderful things about working with academic presses, so I always like to give somebody an opportunity to sing their praises if I can.
Well, it's like Joyce Harrison. I had Joyce Harrison on the show. And one of the things she said is that, one of the things to keep in mind is that these academic presses, they're not out to get you, right? If your book is successful, then everybody's successful. That's what they're there to kind of help you navigate that process. And she is a great example. Other folks that I know are great examples of, if you have a question, reach out. They're not going to turn you down or turn you away. They're happy to answer even the most basic questions. And for those of us who are navigating this for the first time or have navigated this for the first time, you do have questions. You don't know how the process works. There's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes. And so the more that you can kind of find someone to as a sounding board and kind of get some of those early questions answered, then the better off you'll be.
Awesome. And then before I let you go, I know we are just gearing up for Rise of the Mavericks. It's just coming out. It's fresh. Yes. It's your baby. But I have to ask, I would be remiss if I didn't check in and say, do you have any other projects in the hopper?
I do. I'm kind of nibbling around the edges of a project that's going to take a little bit of a larger look at communications intelligence and kind of modern warfare and kind of the relationship between the two. So just starting the research phase for that. So there's a lot of months ahead. But yeah, absolutely. We've all got more projects that we can keep up with, right?
Exactly. And for my listeners out there, be sure to pick yourself up a copy of Rise of the Mavericks. It is really, truly a fascinating study of military intelligence and kind of the inner workings of how those agencies come together, and you won't be disappointed. So thanks again, Philip.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And there you have it, folks. If you want to learn more about Philip or his podcast, please check him out at his website or on Twitter. I have included links to everything in the show notes. And thanks again to Philip for coming on and talking about your work with me. It was a pleasure. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.